You walk under the scorching sun. The leather strap cuts into your shoulders, dust sticks to your legs, and ahead there are still 200 days of journey. In your stomach there is emptiness and only the bitter taste of vinegar on your tongue. At this moment a question arises. What did the people eat who marched 50 kilometers a day, carrying armor, weapons, and the future of the entire empire? And most importantly, how did they survive when there were no markets, no fields, no houses with supplies around? We will find the answers in the sources themselves, but the main revelation awaits at the end. What seems to us today like hunger and torment, for the Roman soldier became the main weapon of his will. Historians write that a legionary received about 800 grams of grain per day on campaign. This was not ready bread, but dry grains that the soldier was obliged to grind and bake himself. Polybius mentioned this as the main feature of discipline. The warrior had to not only fight, but also feed himself with his own hands. And it was from this grain that a rough flatbread was baked, which became the basis of the ration. These flatbreads were called panis. But it's important to understand this was not soft white bread, but a hard, almost stone-like crust that could be stored for weeks. Panis was a symbol of endurance, a piece of dry bread as hard as the character of a legionnaire. The image is clear. Imagine a warrior who, after 20 kilometers of marching, sits by the fire in the evening, takes out a stone handmill, grinds grain, kneads dough, and bakes his only dinner on the coals. His breath mixes with the smoke, his hands tremble from fatigue, but only after this does he earn the right to food. Bread and labor became inseparable. To prepare this bread, each soldier carried with him a metal or clay vessel and a small handmill. The term used for such a campaign meal was mola. It was not light, up to 3 kilograms in weight, and so the soldier already carries not only weapons, armor, shield and cauldron, but also his small bread factory. Excavations of camps in Britain and Germany show charred grains, remains of millstones, fragments of ovens. All this confirms the words of ancient historians. Archaeology brings the picture to life. Not just abstract bread, but blackened lumps of grain as if baked by time. And in them you can see the trace of weary military life. But even bread was not enough. For taste and disinfection, soldiers mixed it with water and added an acid seasoning, vinegar. This liquid was called posca. This was not a drink in our understanding, but rather a remedy for thirst. A sharp, sour, burning taste that killed bacteria and gave an illusion of freshness in warm water. Drinking posca was like taking a gulp of fire, but it was precisely this that saved from diseases on the road. An important contrast. The Romans had no sweet drinks. They didn't even have wine in the usual sense, only vinegar diluted with water. For a modern person, this sounds like punishment, but it was precisely posca that kept the soldier on his feet, and therefore its taste for them was not a symbol of deprivation, but a symbol of life. Each sip of this acid solution reminded, you are part of the legion, you drink the same thing as your neighbor in formation, you are hungry and tired just like him. In this unity of food and hardships, strength was born. And if today bread and vinegar are symbols of poverty for us, for the legionnaire they were symbols of survival. But new trials awaited him ahead, and simple food became a heavy weapon of discipline. It was precisely this harsh ration that made Rome's army invincible. But what else did these people eat on campaign, when bread and vinegar became insufficient? On campaign, the Roman soldier marched not only with bread and vinegar, but with an entire household on his shoulders. The total burden could reach 30 kilograms, and in this weight was hidden not only armor. Livy noted that the discipline of legionnaires consisted in each one carrying his own property, tent, stakes, dishes, handmill for grain, and food supplies for at least 2 weeks. Such a load was nicknamed Martian baggage, because its weight felt as if the iron hand of war was pressing on the shoulder. To carry all this, legionnaires used a special construction, a wooden pole with a crossbar that they threw over their backs. This pole was called sarcina. It was the prototype of the modern backpack. A cauldron, bag with grain, tools, and even personal items were suspended from it. A legionnaire looked like a moving market where each thing had its place and purpose. The image is clear. Imagine formations of soldiers walking across rough terrain. On each one's shoulders sticks out a tall pole, to which leather bags, metal cauldrons, wooden bows are tied. All this clangs with every step, as if the legion moves to the ringing of its own kitchen and forge. This noise was no less recognizable than the sound of their steps. But the heaviest trial awaited them not in battle, but on the march. Romans were obliged to cover up to 30 kilometers per day, sometimes more if the commander was hurrying to the battle site. Caesar wrote that his troops could overcome up to 50 kilometers in a day, if the situation required it. For a modern person, this distance is comparable to a running marathon. Only the soldier didn't just run, but dragged armor, weapons and baggage on himself. Among these items, the pickaxe and shovel held a special place. Legionnaires were not only warriors, but also builders. Every evening they erected a fortified camp with a ditch and rampart, and this took strength that remained at the limit after the march. The term used for this constant construction was castra. Castra was a temporary camp that was erected anew every day. The visual image of castra is striking. Hundreds of soldiers line up, begin to dig earth, drive in stakes, stretch leather tents. The evening sky is colored with smoke from fires, and around the camp grows the serrated line of the ditch. No army in the world at that time possessed such a habit of disciplined construction. But let's return to food. Bread and vinegar were the foundation. However, archaeological finds show sometimes soldiers had the opportunity to diversify their ration. At camps in Britain and Gaul, archaeologists found bones of pigs and cows charred on fires. This speaks to the fact that, when possible, soldiers arranged improvised meat treats. But meat was not included in the standard ration. It was considered a luxury and most often went to officers. When an animal was successfully slaughtered, the meat was boiled in a cauldron and divided among a dozen soldiers. Such a group of 10 was called contubernium. This was a small military family of 8 to 10 people who lived in one tent, shared one pot and one meal for grain. Contubernium was the heart of soldier life. Here they shared bread, water, joy and hardships. Imagine an evening in the camp. 10 people sit around a fire, cooking stew from bones and grain. The cauldron stands on stones, wooden bowls stand around it. Each receives his portion, and the smell of smoky broth fills the air. This simple food bound them together, stronger than any orders. But not everything always ended with a peaceful dinner. If supply trains with provisions were delayed, legionnaires had to survive on what they could obtain themselves. Wild plants, berries came into use. Sometimes they caught birds and fish. Plutarch wrote that in harsh conditions, legionnaires could feed even on wild grasses just to maintain strength. And here vinegar played a saving role. Even dirty water from swamps or rivers could be diluted with posca and made suitable for drinking. This sour taste became a symbol of campaign life. It cut the throat but granted survival. Every detail mattered. A piece of bread, a pinch of salt, a sip of sour liquid. And all this had to be obtained and carried on oneself. In conditions of a 200-day campaign, food turned not into pleasure, but into a constant trial. And precisely for this reason, when a soldier finished his dinner and lay down on the ground under a leather tent, he knew tomorrow he would face all the same things: bread, vinegar, march, and work. This was a closed circle that only a tempered spirit could endure. But this spirit had a price: exhaustion and disease. The question is, how did the Romans cope when simple rations stopped supporting strength? When a campaign lasted months, simple bread and vinegar became insufficient. The soldier's body began to weaken, muscles lost strength, and endurance faded. Ancient authors did not hide. Hunger was not a rarity, but a usual companion of military campaigns. Tacitus wrote that during distant campaigns, legionnaires sometimes reached extreme need, and only iron discipline kept them in formation. To somehow diversify food, porridge was included in the ration. The most common dish was thick porridge from wheat or barley. It was cooked in a cauldron with water, sometimes adding pieces of vegetables or a bit of lard. Such stew was called pulse. Pulse was not just food, it was the energy base of a legionnaire, an analog of modern sports gel for marathon runners. It quickly satisfied, warmed, and allowed moving forward. Visually, pulse looked like a thick viscous mass resembling glue. Soldiers scooped it with wooden spoons and sometimes ate it directly with their hands. There were no spices, no oil, only the taste of grain and smoke from the fire. But after several hours of marching, even this tasteless lamp turned into salvation. Sources mention that on campaigns, Romans tried to store dried beans, lentils, and chickpeas. These legumes were a cheap source of protein and could be stored for a long time. Archaeologists found remains of such crops in military camps throughout Europe. Beans swelled in water, were cooked until soft, and added to pools, turning it into a more nutritious stew. The contrast is striking. In peacetime, Romans enjoyed wine, olive oil, fish, fruits, while on campaign their food turned into a harsh mixture of bread, porridge, and sour water. A legionnaire lived as if in two worlds, peaceful, well-fed, and campaign, hungry. But the heaviest trial became the shortage of salt. Salt was not just seasoning, but a vital element without which muscles stopped working. In antiquity, salt was valued so highly that the word salary, wages, came from it. A soldier receiving his salt ration felt this as precious. Salt in the Roman army was called sal. The image of salt on campaign is vivid. A small bag tied with rope was stored in the knapsack, like treasure. Loss of salt could cost health and life, and sometimes became the cause of mutinies, and therefore every gram was distributed carefully and strictly. Archaeology confirms, in camps they find salt crystals, remains of amphorae in which salt was transported. This shows that the salt issue was organized centrally. Without it, it was impossible to preserve meat, prepare stew, or maintain strength and heat. Along with salt, fats were an important source of energy. When soldiers had access to pork lard, they used it as a universal product, added it to porridge, fried bread, greased dishes. But more often lard remained a rarity, and then the legionnaire might do with only bread and water. Caesar mentioned that during long marches, soldiers often found themselves on the brink of exhaustion. In his commentaries on the Gallic War, he describes how legionnaires could walk all day without food, and in the evening make do with only cake and water. This is not a literary device. Archaeologists confirm that in camps they sometimes find remains of cake from oil seeds. This was food of desperation, a way to survive when grain was insufficient. It was precisely in such conditions that the essence of military discipline was revealed. The centurion commanding 100 soldiers watched not only formation, but also food distribution. A centurion was not just an officer, but a stern overseer of campaign life. His task was to ensure that everyone received bread, that grain was ground, that cauldrons stood on the fire. Without this, the legion could not exist. In the evening, when the sun descended beyond the horizon and fires flared up in the camp, the life of legionnaires turned into a monotonous ritual. Cooking porridge, sharing bread, a sip of sour posca. All this was accompanied by conversations, jokes, and sometimes songs. Fatigue found outlet in words and noise, but in the morning, everything repeated. And then came the moment when rations stopped replenishing strength. People grew thin, faces became grey, and the campaign continued. Diseases raised their heads: diarrhea, weakness, fever. And then the question came to the forefront: how to hold the army together if the soldier was no longer able to walk? The answer lay not only in food, but also in the system of punishments and motivations that forced even an exhausted warrior to continue the path. And precisely here lies the terrible secret of Roman discipline. When a soldier began to weaken, the Roman army gave him no right to rest. The legion was a machine, and if one gear broke, this threatened the entire mechanism. Tacitus and Polybius wrote, "Discipline in Roman troops was harsher than battle itself. Weakness on the march was perceived almost as treason. A tired warrior could slow the formation, disrupt the entire rhythm, and therefore endanger the legion." To prevent this from happening, officers used a system of harsh punishments. The most severe was decimation. Imagine, if a unit showed cowardice or weakened discipline, every 10th soldier was brought forward, and his own comrades had to kill him with clubs or stones. This terrible ritual instilled in the rest: there is no place for weakness in the army. The term decimation itself came from the Latin decimus, 10th. This word still sounds like a death sentence, but in daily life punishments were simpler and simultaneously more torturous. A soldier could be deprived of rations, left without bread, sent to dig a ditch twice as much as required. For an exhausted warrior, this was almost torture. The centurion, stern guardian of discipline, did not allow relaxation. His staff, vitis, was a symbol of power. A blow from the vitis could fall on anyone who hesitated or complained. The image of the vitis is terrible and simple, a thin stick from grapevine with which the commander beat his subordinates. Each blow was a reminder that the army does not forgive self-pity. A soldier, weakened by hunger, still got up and walked further, because behind his back loomed not only death from the enemy, but also punishment from his own. But punishment was only one side, the other was collective support. Contubernium, the small group of comrades already mentioned, turned into family. If one fell ill, the rest shared food with him, helped carry baggage. Archaeological finds show many cauldrons found in camps have traces of repeated repairs. This means that things were cherished, shared, mended. A soldier lived not alone, but together, and in this community found strength to endure. However, even community did not always save. In the campaign against the Germans in the 1st century AD, legionnaires found themselves without provisions for several weeks. Tacitus wrote that people ate plant roots, grasses, even tree bark. For us, this sounds like a picture of survival in the wild, but for them, this was part of service. Warriors with weapons in hand, wrapped in bronze straps, turned into gatherers bent over the earth. Archaeology confirms these words. In places of ancient camps, they find remains of wild grasses ground together with grain. This means that soldiers mixed into bread everything they could find: leaves, stems, even wheat seeds. Flatbreads became even rougher and heavier, but remained food. And yet, in the most difficult moments, officers came to the rescue. A legate commanding an entire legion could order the release of reserve rations from the supply train. These reserves were stored in granaries and transported on wagons under guard. But the supply train did not always reach the troops in time. Roads were difficult, enemy attacks frequent, and then soldiers had only one option: continue walking and wait. In this survival system, the signal played a key role. The army had an order for giving commands with the help of a trumpet, called tuba. This instrument, long and copper, sounded throughout the camp. At the tuba signal, soldiers rose, began marching, built castra. Even in exhaustion, they could not disobey. The tuba was not just music, it was the voice of discipline. Imagine this morning. Fog still hangs over the field. The body aches from hunger, the stomach is empty. But suddenly the air is pierced by a copper sound. The soldier rises, takes his shield, puts on armor, picks up sarcina. There is no time for pity, no time for an extra breath. The sound of the trumpet tears a person from weakness and pushes him back into the army's rhythm. This is how Romans dealt with exhaustion: fear of punishment, support of comrades, rare rations from the supply train, and unceasing discipline. But ahead of which awaited the culmination of the campaign, battle. And precisely here the harsh rations and unbearable conditions became the decisive weapon. For a hungry, exhausted but hardened soldier could turn into a perfect fighting machine. And therefore, the question sounded louder and louder. Would these people have enough strength to endure not only the march, but also the enemy's strike? Battle for a Roman soldier was a continuation of the march. The same tired legs, the same empty stomach, only now to fatigue was added the rumble of weapons and the smell of blood. Polybius wrote that precisely the habit of hardships made a legionnaire steadfast in battle. Hunger and fatigue, experienced on the march, turned him into a hardened fighter for whom battle seemed just another trial. Before battle, the ration did not change. Bread and posca remained unchanged. Sometimes they issued dry grain to cook porridge right on the spot, if circumstances allowed. But more often a soldier went into battle after a night on an empty stomach. This creates an image of an army that fights not on satiety, but on the inner fire of discipline. In the center of the field stood heavy infantry, compressed in ranks. They were called hastati in early times, and later simply legionnaires. They held shields, forming a dense line. Each soldier knew his endurance was not only his life, but also his neighbor's life. One's weakness opened a breach, and the breach could cost victory. Before battle, signals of trumpets and drums rang out. These sounds awakened even the most exhausted warriors. To hear them was like breathing in fury. In the rumble of copper and in the rhythm of beats was born readiness to go forward. Historians note that Romans created the rhythm of battle even before the fight began. This was a psychological blow capable of suppressing the enemy. On the battlefield, endurance developed by bread and porridge turned into a weapon. The enemy, unaccustomed to multi-day marches, tired faster. But Romans continued to stand, gripping shields and spears. Their bodies were used to deprivations, and precisely for this reason they endured longer. The formation had special significance. When the enemy struck with arrows and stones, soldiers raised shields, forming a living roof. Such formation was called testudo, tortoise. Shields above, shields on the sides, solid bronze shell. Inside it, people heard the rumble of blows on wood, felt arrows sliding over the surface, but remained unharmed. The image of testudo is impressive. Dozens of people hidden under one armor, like ants under a shell. A hungry soldier who yesterday chewed stale flatbread, today turned into part of a huge tortoise stepping directly at the enemy, and no fear could stop it. But not only discipline held the army, officers played their role. The tribune, responsible for order and communication between the legate and soldiers, watched that the column did not fall apart. His presence in battle was a sign. You are being watched, you must hold on. It was precisely tribunes, according to Livy, who inspired soldiers by personal example, raised the fallen and returned the fleeing. When hand-to-hand combat began, the legionnaire was already exhausted, but not broken. His ration, however meager it was, allowed the body to function, and discipline forced him to go forward. Shield struck shield, sword rang against armor, and each step was a trial. In this moment, the soldier understood. Everything he ate, everything he endured on the march, everything came down to this second. Archaeological finds show that, after battles at campsites, they found charred flatbreads and porridge remains. This means, even on the eve of battle, legionnaires did not abandon their usual ritual. They ate bread, drank vinegar, and only after this went into battle. The ritual of food was the same weapon as sword or spear. It was precisely thanks to this system of nutrition and endurance that Rome defeated enemies who often had better weapons or numerical superiority. Soldiers endured blows longer than the opponent, and this decided the outcome. But such endurance had a dark side. Constant undernourishment, exhausting marches, and heavy battles broke people physically. A soldier could endure one campaign, but rarely remain the same person after several campaigns. His body was exhausted and his soul hardened in the harsh forge of war. And yet the army continued to march. Each new campaign became a continuation of the past, and bread and vinegar remained symbols of this endless road. But history always has a conclusion, and it turns out to be far more terrible than hungry marches and battles, because the real question lay not only in how soldiers survived on campaign, but also in what trace is left on the fate of the empire itself. 200 days of journey, 200 evenings by fires that smelled of smoke and sour vinegar, 200 nights spent on the ground under leather tents. This period not only tested the soldier's body, it reforged it into new material. From an ordinary peasant or craftsman was born an instrument of war. But what happened next when the campaign ended? Historians note, a legionnaire returning from campaign looked different. He was thin, weathered, with sunburned skin and exhausted facial features. His body retained strength but lost softness, and his gaze became heavy. Tacitus wrote that precisely such people comprised the steel foundation of the empire, hardened, survived, accustomed to deprivations. Their ration left a trace not only on the body, but also on fate. Constant life on bread and vinegar developed special endurance. For us this sounds like hunger, but for a Roman this was the norm. Archaeology confirms, in camps they often find huge granaries and pits for storing posca, and nearby practically empty warehouses with meat. This speaks to the fact that meat and wine were rarities, while grain and vinegar were everyday. But it was precisely this harsh food that allowed accomplishing the impossible. In Caesar's era, Armies covered thousands of kilometers, fought in Gaul, Britain, in the Balkans. Warriors lived for months on the same ration, but precisely this made them the terror of peoples. Goldsworthy wrote, "The strength of the Roman legion lay not only in tactics and weapons, but also in people's ability to endure more than their enemies." The image is clear. Imagine an enemy dressed in warm furs, accustomed to home food. The first days he fights fiercely, but then fatigue and hunger take their toll. And opposite him, a Roman soldier who is used to walking for weeks, feeding only on bread and porridge. Who will endure longer? The answer is obvious. Discipline reinforced this result. A soldier could not refuse the march, could not drop weapons, could not complain. Behind him stood a centurion with vitis. Nearby walked comrades from contubernium. Ahead sounded the tuba trumpet. The entire army was arranged so that personal weakness dissolved in collective strength. But this success had a price. Weak rations and constant deprivations led to diseases. Modern studies of legionnaire bones show traces of malnutrition, exhaustion, chronic inflammations. People died not only from swords, but also from hunger, diseases, weakness. Sometimes losses from diseases exceeded combat losses. The history of Caesar's campaign in Britain confirms. Part of the army had to be left on the shore precisely because of diseases caused by lack of normal food. And yet the army marched on. The empire could not afford to stop. For the sake of this bread and vinegar, roads were built, warehouses created, supply trains sent. An entire supply system, most complex for its time, rested on the simplest products. The long-term consequences were colossal. Rome created such a model of enduring army that for centuries it remained an example. Even modern military historians acknowledge the idea of minimal but stable rations became the foundation of many future armies. Field rations in many countries even today consist of bread, porridge, dried products and sour drinks performing the role of posca. But the main result was not in organization and not in logistics. The main lesson was that the army was built on human endurance, on readiness to endure, on the ability to live where it seemed impossible to live. Precisely this turned the legion into an instrument for conquering the world. And so we return to the very beginning. The question sounded simple. What did Roman soldiers eat during 200 days on campaign? We know the answer. Bread and vinegar, sometimes beans and porridge, rarely meat. But the real meaning is different. These products were not food, but a test of strength of spirit, of steadfastness, of readiness to subordinate the body to discipline. And now the question for each of us. Could you yourself pass even one day in this formation? Could you eat hard bread, wash it down with sour water and drag 30 kilograms of baggage, knowing that tomorrow would be the same? Could you endure 200 days that separate an ordinary person from a legionnaire? Roman soldiers proved a person is capable of surviving where it seems impossible, and precisely this readiness to endure made their army invincible, and the empire itself eternal. In this harsh, bread and vinegar was hidden the strength that changed the history of the world.